Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. And I just hope you're doing very well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And what an amazing story. Two people have witnessed a murder. Well, they've witnessed a body being disposed of in a lake, and then they have witnessed two Bigfoot taking that body away. So the story is getting increasingly more curious. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 4 of our story tonight. My grandfather continued. As I was telling you, when me and your grandmother joined the Magpies, we had become close. All of us had. We were like one big happy extended family, because we shared a love of birds in common. And as I told you, the generation gap simply did not matter. After Paul Mitchin disposed of his wife's corpse in the lake, even your grandmother was saying that she thought that possibly both Esmeralda and Paul must have had an argument that day. Things had got out of control, and Paul had lost it, and then in a moment of unbridled rage, he had killed his wife. I knew there was more to the story than met the eye, but I wasn't expecting at our very next bird gathering that Paul Mitchin would confess to what he'd done. You mean he simply admitted to murdering his wife? I can't believe that, said Keegan. He went to so much trouble to cover up his crime. He disposed of his wife's body in the lake, and then he candidly admits to what he's done. That's not normal. Well, it's not exactly like that, Keegan, said my grandmother, interjecting. Me and your grandfather went to another bird rendezvous with the rest of the magpies, you see. I can't remember the spot, but I do remember it overlooked a magnificent lake. We were all sitting in a bird hide, overlooking this lake, watching the birds, but I was the one that was examining Paul Mitchin's demeanour very, very intently, to see if he was exhibiting any signs of guilt over what he'd recently done to his wife Esmeralda. I noticed he was extremely pale and emaciated. He looked as if he hadn't eaten a hearty meal for many days. In front of the entire bird group, I suddenly burst out and said, "How's your wife, Paul?" And that, I'm afraid, was the straw that broke the camel's back. After I asked that question, Paul just buckled up. He broke down, let me tell you. I'd never seen a man just burst into tears before. So we all naturally gathered around him and asked him what was wrong, although of course me and your grandfather knew exactly why Paul was so obviously distressed. But we wisely said absolutely nothing. I killed Esmeralda. I killed my wife. She's no longer with us, he said. If you want to know where she is, she's buried at the bottom of a lake. You can call the police if you like. Have me arrested for murder. It's no less than what I deserve. What the hell happened? Robin Cartwright asked. You're a good man, Paul. You must have finally snapped, and I can't blame you for that. I'd have probably killed that woman myself if I was married to her, and I'm not even a violent man. That wife of yours was insufferable. Tell us what happened. I'm sure she provoked you to anger, and you just snapped. It happens, but it's not premeditated. At this point, Paul Mitchin pulled up his shirt. Oh, my word, I've never seen anything like it in my entire life. All kinds of old and fresh bruises all over his chest, burnt marks everywhere, from where his wife Esmeralda had stamped out cigarettes on his skin. Can you believe that someone would actually do a thing like that to another person? Well, everyone in the Magpies was very distraught by this. They could see the years of abuse indelibly marked on that poor man's skin. Apparently Esmeralda would regularly take a heavy metal cast iron pan and throttle Paul with it, sometimes so forcefully that he could barely walk the next day. And that woman had broken many of his bones, you know. He always made light of those broken bones to the nurses at the local hospital, because he didn't want to draw attention to the fact that his wife was mistreating him so very badly. I remember feeling incredibly angry that Esmeralda had been abusing him for all those years. If she had been alive, I'd have throttled her myself, let me tell you." "What happened, Paul?" asked Robin kindly, in a very gentle, reassuring voice. "Please tell us. We cannot help you if you don't tell us what happened. And based on how that dreadful woman has been beating you up for all these years, I have no sympathy for Esmeralda's current plight, I'm afraid. At least the abuse has stopped." Paul was physically shaking as he told us his story. His eyes were filled with a great deal of regret, almost as if he blamed himself for what had happened. "Well," he said candidly, "I told Esmeralda that you had told me, Robin, that I was welcome to use Bridge Connor's cabin to do a spot of bird watching. So I told her about it and she blew a gasket. I said I would really enjoy spending a weekend away on my own at the cabin, taking advantage of the bird hides on the property, so I might be able to spot some unusual bird life. Esmeralda was incensed by this. She screamed at me furiously. 'I let you go bird-watching with the magpies against my better judgment. And now look at you. You want to spend a weekend all on your own at Bridge Connor's cabin near Banff so you can watch birds. You're pathetic. You're a grown man, fixated on watching birds. What's wrong with you? I'm sorry, Paul, but you're not going anywhere. You're staying here with me, whether you like it or not.' When my wife Esmeralda told me that, well, normally I'd just shut up, say nothing more about it. In truth, the idea of going bird-watching at Bridget Connor's cabin was very appealing to me. I've heard how good the bird-watching is over at his place. I decided to express my desire to go more passionately, knowing full well, of course, that I was only going to make my wife all the more angry. But for some reason I couldn't help myself. It's just one weekend, Esmeralda. I don't get opportunities like this every day. Please, just this once let me go." At that remark of mine, all hell broke loose in the kitchen. Esmeralda was incensed. She was drinking a glass of wine. She threw it at me, and the red wine spilt over my shirt and onto the kitchen floor, and there was a lot of it, along with shards of broken glass that were standing up like deadly weapons. "Look what you made me do! I've broken that wine glass, and there's wine everywhere on the kitchen floor. I wanted to enjoy this drink, but you made me so mad. How dare you argue with me, Paul? I told you you're not going to go to that cabin in Banff. Why the hell won't you listen to me?" And there she was again, with the cast-iron frying pan in her hand, thrusting it towards me. In that moment I didn't fancy any more bruises on my battered body, so I grabbed her hand to stop her, and managed to extract the cast-iron pan from her. I will admit I'd never done such a bold thing before, but I was very tired of being beaten up by my wife, and for the first time in a long time, I stood up for myself and put up some resistance. I was tired of her telling me what I could and could not do, and treating me like an insubordinate child that needed to be towed into line. My resistance provoked Esmeralda to a level of irrational rage that I have never seen before. Her face was red. She was grinding her teeth. She ran over to the butcher's block and grabbed a sharp knife, which she began waving around precariously in front of me. And then she became manically deranged, and that was when I knew she was going to stab me, because all sense of rationality had flown out of the kitchen window. My wife had become like a rabid wild animal that was foaming at the mouth and was out of control. I'd never seen her so irate before. She lunged towards me with the knife, making a straight aim for my chest. I knew if I didn't defend myself or stop her, that I would be a dead man. I pushed her away from me. The knife went flying into the air, landing on the floor. Esmeralda suddenly fell backwards, slipping on the wine that was on the floor, and falling over a huge glass shard that went straight through her chest. There was blood weeping from that wound, so much of it. I ran over to her, kneeling over her body and trying to wake her up, but she was out cold. and then I felt her pulse, and I realized in that moment she was not breathing. I think she died before she bled out. I tried to, do the best I could for her, give her some CPR, but nothing worked to revive her. She was dead. I think she died from a head wound, rather than from the glass shard, but I can't be sure. I know I should have gone to the police, but I was scared. I was afraid they wouldn't believe my story. They'd think I'd killed my wife. The kitchen looked like a formidable crime scene, let me tell you. Well, when Paul Mitchin told us his story, we unequivocally believed every word of it. And we decided that he needed to put this behind him, and that we should all pretend that none of this had happened. And it worked out fine, you know. No one ever asked Paul any questions about his missing wife, because Esmeralda just didn't have any friends to speak of. So Paul just told anyone who asked that they had separated. No one ever knew that she went missing. We grew very fond of Paul Mitchin over the years, keeping his secret buried between us. He finally did meet a lovely lady, so he lived a happy and long life, until him and his new lady friend died when they reached their late 90s. I never doubted Paul's story for a second, and I will say this. When he began to live a brand new life without Esmeralda, he blossomed so much. It was like he came alive again. Paul Mitchin went to his grave believing Esmeralda's body was at the bottom of that lake. But me and your grandfather knew very differently. We were well aware that 2 Bigfoot had removed her remains, but I'm sure they buried her somewhere nice. Well, I like to think that anyway, even though she didn't deserve to be fussed over, after what she'd done to Paul. Wow, that's an incredible story, said Keegan, his eyes brightening. I'm glad you kept Paul Mitchin's secret. His wife was a prize cow. As far as I'm concerned, he didn't murder her at all. The woman was coming at him with a knife. He pushed her away to save himself. She fell backwards on the wine she'd spilt, and the glass she'd broken. If she hadn't been so outraged in the first place with Paul over something so insignificant, none of this would ever have happened. It was an accident. That is what all the magpies believed. We told Paul that. We told him that his wife had brought this upon herself, that it was a dreadful accident, and he was only pushing her away from him when she came at him with that knife. Most of us felt that by the sounds of things, she was manic, that if Paul had not defended himself in the way he'd done, she'd have probably successfully killed him. I think the reassurances from all the magpies helped Paul gain a sense of perspective over everything, and put this dreadful calamity behind him. He was, of course, willing to go to the police and confess to everything, but everyone in the Magpies said they'd take his secret down to the grave with them, and they were true to their words, But now that Paul Mitchin is dead, it doesn't really matter that we are sharing his story now. The things that happen to people, said Keegan. The world is alive with the interesting stories of people's lives. And you and Gramps, well, you own this amazing story. I know, said my grandmother. It is remarkable, and I'm glad we shared it with you boys. Wait a minute, I've got something to show you. I found this on a recent trip to Banff, It's a flyer about a cabin available for rent. And would you believe it? I was dumbfounded when I saw it. I discovered that this is the cabin that me and your grandfather stayed in. The cabin where we observed the 2 Bigfoot by the lake. The place is being rented out by a man called Keith Conway, so I guess he must be connected to the original owner, Bridge Conway. And he's a grandson, I imagine, or something like that. The place is available to book over the weekends. My grandmother looked up at my grandfather and said, Come on, William, let's do it, shall we? Our grandchildren would really appreciate it, Let's do what? Asked my grandfather, looking a tad perplexed, as if he couldn't get the gist of what my grandmother was trying to say. Well, I was thinking if we hire out the cabin that we stayed in all those years ago for next weekend, or this weekend, actually this weekend would be better. We could take our grandchildren back to where it all happened. Go on, it would be great fun. We can take them fishing and bird watching. How about it?" "Oh, that would be amazing!" I cried out enthusiastically. "I'd love to go to that cabin, Grandpa, where you and Granny saw the Bigfoot. Please, can't we go?" My grandfather looked up at me in surprise. He was taken aback by my enthusiastic outburst, which was unusual for me, as by nature I could be quite reticent. Moments later my two brothers were echoing my very sentiments about this potential weekend escape, which would make my grandparents' story come alive for us even more. "You would be keen to go to the cabin?" my grandfather asked me. "Very keen," I said. "But I guess it might be too expensive, because you yourself said the place was very special, so I don't imagine it's very cheap." "That's not what I'm worried about," said my grandfather. "Your grandmother fails to realize that Banff is a very popular tourist destination, and places like the Conaway cabin, well, let's not kid. They're often booked up months, sometimes years in advance. I very much doubt we'd even get a look in, especially at such late notice for this weekend." My grandmother, who was a perennial optimist by nature, eagerly urged my grandfather to phone Keith Conaway, who owned the cabin that my grandparents had frequented all those years ago. "The booking number is on the leaflet, William," she said, handing it to him. "Please give Keith Conaway a call, will you? If he says the place is booked up, fair enough. I can understand that. But there's always a chance it might be available for us. So why don't you give him a call, just for the hell of it?" "All right, Emma. I'll give him a call for your sake. But I'm begging you not to get your hopes up. A cabin like that would be in high demand in Banff, and I'm pretty certain it shall not be available." I held my breath, as did both my brothers, as my grandfather put his phone on loudspeaker so we could all listen in to the conversation. All I could think about was that if we could go on this weekend retreat, maybe I might also spot a Bigfoot. Whether my brothers were nursing similar thoughts, I had no idea. "Hello, Keith Conaway speaking. How can I help you?" "Hello, Mr. Conway. This is William Bennett speaking. I'm just phoning you about your cabin near Banff. I was wondering if it might be available for this weekend. I'm sorry it's late notice, because I would like to book it for me and my grandchildren if I may." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Bennett. I'm afraid the cabin is booked up 2 years in advance. We won't be able to oblige your request, I'm afraid. But give me your details anyway, just in case there is a possible cancellation. But I feel I should warn you that very rarely ever happens." "So what did I tell you? Did I not warn you?" said my grandfather, after he'd ended the phone call, glancing over at our disappointed faces. But I doubt anybody was more disappointed than I was. It was about an hour later that the phone rang again, and my grandfather answered it. "Hello," he said. "Hello, is that William Bennett?" "This is he, speaking," said my grandfather. "Oh, hello, Mr. Bennett. This is Keith Conaway speaking. I was talking to you an hour ago on the phone about the cabin near Banff you wish to book for the weekend." "Ah, that's right," said my grandfather. "What about it?" The phone was still on loudspeaker, so when we heard that Keith Conaway was on the telephone, speaking to my grandfather, me and my brother and my grandmother were surrounding him like an eager pack of coyotes, hoping that there might be something we could put our teeth into. Could there be a change of plan, perhaps, I wondered? Could it be that there might have been a sudden and last-minute cancellation? Please, God, let this be the case. Could I dare to hope, I wondered? I found myself crossing my fingers tightly and looking at my grandfather with wide, almost begging eyes. "Well, Mr. Bennett, I do believe I've got some good news for you. I don't know how this has happened, because it never does. But against all the odds, we've had a last-minute cancellation. The people who hired the cabin you want to hire from me have paid for it in full, along with the food supplies and everything else. But something important appears to have come up for them, so they cannot use the cabin this weekend. They have generously offered it to you. Free of charge, I hasten to say. So everything will be accessible to you. Food and anything else you might need. It's all yours for the weekend if you want it." I'm not exactly sure what my grandfather said to answer Mr. Conaway, because by then we were all shrieking with delight, for we couldn't believe our good fortune and how our luck had miraculously changed, because not only were we going to stay at that beautiful cabin in Banff, but we were going to stay there with all our expenses paid. And from the leaflet, I knew that that cabin did not come cheap. I do recall that when we arrived at the cabin, which according to my grandfather was like a piece of cake to find, compared to all those years ago, because now everything was clearly marked, and the roads were a lot less laborious than they had been in the 1960s, although in these parts they were still a tumble of dirt roads, and on some of those sequestered roads we passed elk and white-tailed deer that didn't even scamper away as we drove past them. They seemed tame. Then we saw a signpost and a little arrow, which my grandmother pointed to excitedly. "This is it! We go down that tiny road through the trees, and then we'll finally get to the cabin." My grandfather's white SUV rattled precariously as we drove up a dirt road that was fringed by tall, lofty trees on both sides. The road, as my grandmother had informed us, opened up into an alpine field or meadow that was set against the most breathtaking escarpment of mountains that seized the skyline in a pompously self-assured sculptural deportment that demanded your immediate attention, while a seeping mist appeared to cover the top of the mountains, rather reminding me of ocean spray over the rocks. It was all so breathtakingly beautiful, as the mountains cast their resplendent reflections over the large silvery lake, that was so gargantuan in size that it spread out across the landscape like a meandering river that snaked through the trees, many of which were casting their ethereal shadows over the lake, while some of them were bent over the water's edge, like old men with hunched backs. As I climbed out of the car, I could see and hear an abundance of bird life. My attention was then drawn to the cabin, which was exactly as my grandmother had described, only better than I could have ever envisaged. I think the cabin had been well maintained over the years, and significantly modernized, so it was both sophisticated and sumptuously cosy in every regard. Even though the cabin had been a stunner in the 1960s, it didn't appear to date in any way, probably because it was a timeless design, and did look every bit to be like a glamorous Swiss chalet, done in that golden wood, with extensively high balconies that made the most of those spectacular, all-encompassing views. The cabin on the inside most certainly did not disappoint. It was extremely well presented. Everything was luxurious, from the plush furnishings to the bed linen and towels, and of course there was a vast selection of food available for us to enjoy, which was like something you'd get from the finest delicatessens. My grandparents became like two teenagers again, caught up in the bubble of their nostalgia. They held hands together as they went around the place exploring the cabin. Then they walked around the lake, revisiting some of the bird hides. Me and my brothers gave them their space, as we went exploring on our own, and as beautiful as it all was to see the place where my grandparents' story had played out, I was suddenly hit with the realization that it would be extremely unlikely that I'd get to see a Bigfoot over the weekend. I mean, what was I really thinking? Everybody knows that Bigfoots are elusive by nature. Some people doubt they even exist, but I'm not one of those cynical types. My brothers were so excited to be at the cabin, and the weekend was so incredibly magical. We enjoyed amazing views, some fishing, hiking, and a spot of bird watching with my grandparents. But all the while, I couldn't stop thinking about a Bigfoot, how much I'd enjoy to have an encounter with one. It was as I was retiring in my bedroom in the cabin that I could see my brother Keegan standing there in the doorway. He looked at me soberly. "Don't be too disappointed, bro," he said to me. "Disappointed? What do you mean disappointed?" I asked him. "You don't have to pretend," said Keegan, his eyes bright with mischief. "I know." "You know what?" I asked. "I know you were hoping to see Bigfoot on this holiday, well, on this weekend, because our grandparents saw 2 Bigfoots years ago. But I hate to break it to you, bro. I don't think it's going to happen again. In fact, I doubt it. Don't they say that lightning never strikes in the same place twice?" I was looking at my brother Keegan. My eyes were on stalks. How could he possibly know how I was feeling on our trip to the cabin, and that I was secretly nursing a fascination for Bigfoot. Keegan began to laugh. He pointed a finger at me. I gotcha. You may be the quiet one of us brothers, but I've known you a long time, bro. I saw how your face lit up like a Christmas tree when Grandpa told us about the 2 Bigfoot he and Granny saw at the lake in 1962. I could sense that you were hoping you would spot a Bigfoot on this trip. I frowned as I tried to avoid Keegan's inquiring gaze. I couldn't believe he knew me so well. He'd figured out exactly what was going on in my mind. All right, I said. I admit I'm disappointed. I was hoping to encounter a Bigfoot, but I had no idea that I was that transparent. I thought I held my feelings in very well. You do hide your feelings extremely well, bro, said Keegan. Sometimes so well, in fact, that I can't figure out what goes on in that head of yours. You're a deep thinker, I know that. But I knew how you were feeling today, because I was feeling it too. You were? I asked, looking at my brother with wide eyes. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me, Keegan? Yes, bro, I am as fascinated about Bigfoot as you are. Don't look so surprised. You have no idea how excited I got when I heard Grandpa's story. I was in absolute shock. And when Grandma suggested we came to the cabin, where this happened for the weekend, my first thought was, what if we get to see a Bigfoot? The truth is, when we arrived here, much like yourself, I was hit with the daunting realization that such an encounter was unlikely to happen for us. So I just wanted you to know, bro, I get how you're feeling, but on the brighter side of things, some things are just not meant to be. I suppose not, I said. That night I retired to my sumptuously cosy bed, with the Egyptian cotton sheets, feeling secretly glad that Keegan felt as I did. It didn't make me feel so alone. He was such a forthcoming person, who wore his heart on his sleeve. But it would seem he had also been nursing a secret fascination for Bigfoot, like myself, but had never been bold enough to admit it to anyone. Well, not until now, that is. It was good to know that he was sharing in my disappointment, because I knew that we would return to my grandparents' place in Toronto, having thoroughly enjoyed a lovely weekend at the cabin, but not having our wish of a Bigfoot encounter being fulfilled. Still, I guess you can't have everything. I reassured myself that we had been extremely lucky coming here. My grandparents' story had come alive for us when we had been to the fishing pier and seen where Paul Mitchin had disposed of his wife Esmeralda's body, and the area on the lake where the Bigfoots had dived into the water to retrieve her body and catch a couple of fish. It was a cool, very pleasant night. As often in the mountains, the temperatures drop significantly, so it can make you sleep blissfully well. The moment my head hit the pillow, I was out like a light. I probably would have slept like a baby, if I wasn't suddenly being jolted wide awake by a very excited Keegan. I felt annoyed to feel my brother shaking me so vigorously in the middle of the night. I had been thrown back to reality, as if I'd been flung through a windscreen window of my dreams and sustained a whiplash injury. It felt a little like that. I looked up at my brother through sleepy eyes, surprised to see how excited he appeared to be. I'd never known my older brother to look like that, not even on Christmas Day when he gets to open up all his presents. This was a look that seemed to engage a mixture of hope and expectation. "What is it?" I grumbled, unable to hide my extreme annoyance. "It's a Bigfoot, I'm sure of it," said Keegan, his voice almost shaking. He sounded that thrilled. At this I sat up sharply. "A Bigfoot? You saw a Bigfoot? My God! Where? Outside the cabin?" I asked him. "No, silly," laughed Keegan. "I heard a Bigfoot whooping. That's what I was trying to tell you." I was now extremely irritated with Keegan. I mean, can you blame me? I had been excited for a brief moment, sharing in his unbridled enthusiasm that a Bigfoot was around. But now there was a catch. He was telling me he'd heard whoops. That didn't mean anything at all as far as I was concerned. A whooping sound could have been anything. It could have come from a bird, a wild animal, not necessarily a Bigfoot. Besides all that, sound can travel over vast distances. So whoever was making the whooping sound, well, it could be anything, couldn't it? And it could be miles away at that. "You woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me you heard whoops, Keegan," I said dismissively. "It could have been a bird, you realise that? In fact, it probably was. Now go away. I want to get back to sleep." "No, you're not going to sleep, bro. We're going to investigate that whooping sound. There is a distinct possibility it could have come from a Bigfoot. And what if I'm right?" "A possibility," I smirked. "Not a certainty. There's a big difference. And even if the whooping did come from a Bigfoot, what are the chances we'd even see the critter?" "Well, there's certainly not going to be any chances with that attitude of yours. If you want to lie here in a bed pontificating, fair enough. Go ahead. Go back to sleep if you like. But if I come back from my little adventure out of doors to tell you I happened to spot a Bigfoot in the woods, and you missed out on that because you wanted to sleep, don't blame me for your loss." My brother's words succeeded in ruffling my feathers significantly, and before I knew it I'd risen out of bed and hurried over to the wardrobe to put on some clothes, including a sweater, for I knew it might be chilly out of doors. It was, as expected, a dark night when we left the cabin, swaddled in silence, along with the sounds of my grandparents' contented snores. I'm not sure they'd have been best pleased had they known we were evacuating the cabin in the middle of the night to search for the elusive cryptid creature that I was certain we would not get to see. The idea of Keegan having an encounter from which I was excluded would be too unbearable, which was why in my foolishness I'd agreed to come along with Keegan on this seemingly thankless stroll through the woods at the dead of night. The night was filled with the orchestra of frogs and crickets. There was a profound nip in the air, and there was dew all over the grass. The velvety black sky was bejewelled with dazzling silvery stars and a crescent-shaped pearly moon. Me and my brother crossed the wooden trellis bridge over the lake and walked through the trail between the trees on the other side, and thank God we were well equipped with torches on hand and were wearing good walking boots. It was pitch black among the trees. Nothing had prepared me for how dark it was. Everything felt airy and incredibly spooky. Many of the trees in the dead of night look ambiguously shadowy, like giants with gnarled hands that are eager to reach out and grab you unawares. As we walked gingerly through the trees, the soles of our walking boots crackled, rather like firewood being burnt on the grate. It was the sound caused from the crashing of twigs and fallen leaves beneath our soles. I tried not to entertain, of course, any fears, but it was difficult as it was so aggressively dark in the woods. It was difficult not to feel vulnerable and very conspicuous. It was then we heard the whooping sounds, and in that moment I felt an excitement bubble up inside me, for I knew instinctively that those whooping sounds did not come from a bird, and they were very close. My heart began to thunder in my chest. I looked at my brother earnestly. "You heard that?" "Of course I heard that. Why do you think I woke you up, bro?" "It's got to be a Bigfoot," I said to him. "It's got to be." It was in that moment, in my quivering excitement, I decided to call out to the Bigfoot in my mind. Why I did this, I do not exactly know. I remember saying, "If you're out there and you're real, please show yourself to us. I've come out on this dark night especially to look for you. I'm begging you to show yourself to us. We mean you no harm. We're just curious to know that you're real." Me and my brother heard the whoops again, and we moved down a path which we believe was where the sound was coming from. You're probably wondering why we would want to encounter a Bigfoot, for there are no guarantees that such an encounter would be of a friendly nature. What if the Bigfoot was mean or intended to harm us, or was a threat to our safety? I'm afraid I did not consider the negative implications of such an encounter, as I'd inherited my grandmother's optimism. And if the truth be told, even though I've heard of people's negative encounters with Bigfoot, I really didn't think that I would need to worry about something like that. We continued down the path through the trees, our visibility cruelly obscured by the forest canopy above our heads that stole away any glimmers of pearly moonlight, but our torches were good enough. Ostensibly, Keegan and I didn't know exactly where we were going, and it didn't even appear to matter to us, for our eagerness projected us ever forward. And then we saw her. She stepped out onto the path, and on her ponderous shoulders she was carrying a small baby. It was a female Bigfoot, very large in size, and Keegan abruptly shone his torch into her face, which she didn't appear to like. But she stood on the path looking at us, and my excitement was like nothing I've ever known before. Every single cell in my entire body stood up to attention as the blood rushed through my veins, prickling my nerve endings with pulses of electricity. Even though my encounter with this female Bigfoot and a baby that looked exactly like her was so fleeting, I took her all in so that I would never forget her as long as I live, and I knew Keegan was doing much the same. I would say she was possibly about 8 foot tall, robustly built, with powerful shoulders and overlong arms. Her body was covered with dark hair, but her human-like face was expressive, and her soulful eyes were dark and deep. Then it happened. A voice entered my head, a voice that was not my own, and it was female. "I heard you call. You wanted me to show myself to you, so here I am. Here I am with my little baby. And yes, I'm real. I must be going now, I'm afraid. My baby needs feeding." And with that, she nodded and glided away. My brother was so shocked by our encounter that the torch he was carrying slipped out of his hand and crashed onto the forest floor. We gawked at each other in amazement. "Bro, we saw a Bigfoot, what did I tell you? Aren't you glad you came with me? What if you were still in bed? You'd have missed out on the most amazing event. Wasn't she beautiful? Wasn't she magnificent? What about the baby she was carrying on her shoulders? Oh, goodness gracious, I've never seen anything so lovely in my whole life. She was real, bro. She was real. We saw her in the flesh. She was standing 3 feet away from us. Oh, and she was so human, so incredibly human. And you could tell she was compassionate by nature. Did you hear her voice? She was speaking to us telepathically. I can't believe we saw a Bigfoot." And those were the words that kept coming out of our mouths. We had seen a Bigfoot, and it was the most wonderful thing we could ever have imagined. We now had a treasured story all of our own that we could add to our grandparents' story, but this was one that we would never forget. Even looking back, I am completely confounded that a single thought I engaged in, that I was having in the woodgrove, was picked up telepathically by a female Bigfoot, who decided, out of sheer kindness, to show herself to me. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and